The other piece of this puzzle is that two things happened in the 60s and 70s that caused zoning to get a lot more restrictive. One of them is going to make you shudder, right, and you're going to fight me on it. The other one, I expect you're going to respond to a little bit more positively. So I'll start with the bad news. So the Fair Housing Act passes in 1968, right? So before 1968, it's very easy to keep people of color out of your town because it's actually not against the law, right? You have homeowners who refuse to sell to people of color, lenders who refuse to lend to people of color, real estate agents, brokers, etc., who, you know, they can do whatever, there's no law against it. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act passes in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And towns have got to come up with a more subtle way to do this. And partly as a result of decades of discrimination, African American families have less income and fewer assets. Most of us, our primary asset is our house. So if before 1968, you're basically not permitted to buy a house, you're not going to have a down payment for a bigger house. You're going to save, not at all. So what happens is you have towns, Fairfield, for example, affordable housing developer out of Stanford has done a really lovely, not yet published study of the history of zoning in Fairfield. And you might think that the way that the zoning history goes is that people start out with really large lots. As a town is rural, they start saying, oh, well, minimum 5 acres, and then they get less restrictive over time. No, it's exactly the opposite. In a town like Fairfield, they're okay with half-acre parcels, etc., until the 60s, basically. And 2-acre minimum lot zoning doesn't happen in Fairfield until the mid-50s. So the Fair Housing Act passes, towns have got to come up with a more subtle way to be racist. Zoning is like, right, cool, let's do that. And they do it. And at the time that they're doing it, the NAACP, the mayors of our urban cities, are coming to their hearings saying, you know the effect of this is going to be to keep out people of lower incomes and people of color. And people at hearings are like, well, yeah, obviously, like, dude, that's why we're here. So it's in the local papers, right? Okay. It's worth noting that even if you don't think that that first nefarious racism story works, there's a coincidence, right? So the coincidence is that in 1968 the Fair Housing Act passes, not just the Fair Housing Act. Through the 70s, we get truth in lending, homeownership equity protection, the CRA. So through the 60s and 70s, we get a series of consumer protection and civil rights legislation that finally makes it more possible for African American families to buy houses, where it was nearly impossible pre-1968. And it just so happens at exactly that moment, these towns shut the door, right? So the door was wide open, we're good, half-acre lots in Fairfield, come on in, right? At exactly the same time that this 70s inflation story happens, on one side, the doors to people of color are opening, and on the other side, they're shutting, right? So even if you don't believe that the planning commissioner in Darien in 1968 was a total, you don't have to buy that story to understand that the disproportionate effect that this story has on people of color. There's a lot that towns can do, and a lot that towns should do, and a lot that towns must do better. That said, some of these problems are systemic, right? I'm not going to stop angry homeowners from showing up at hearings the next time a town tries to, approve a, goodness forbid, a 20-unit multifamily development. And there has to be a role for the state here. I'm very grateful for the leadership role that Commissioner Klein has taken on this. But I think the state can probably do more. In a rare moment of honesty in this, from a planning commissioner in the 60s, the planning director in Fairfield, and this is from that report that this affordable housing developer, Richard Friedman, did on Fairfield, said, this is in 1971, Connecticut zoning has segregated people. A zoning override is essential if housing is to be built. So anybody who's worked in one of these towns for long enough can probably tell you, you all could probably tell me, that this stuff is really hard. And at some point, on the ground, in the towns, You're not necessarily going to see the movement you need to see. The state's going to have to take a leadership role. Right now, the primary mechanism for that state leadership role is Section 8-30G. I think it's an extremely necessary component of what our state does. I'm happy to talk more about it during the Q&A if you'd like. But I think the state's got to keep pushing on this because that's where a lot of the expertise and knowledge and, frankly, identification with the statewide interest in affordability is. No given town wants its population to increase, right? But at the state level, we want the population to increase. And we can't have 169 towns closing their doors to new population in a state where all of us want the state population to go up, right, as a signifier of growth. So I've probably gone over my time. I'll turn it over to Mark.